Okay, thank you very much. Welcome and good morning, and thank you for coming back to day 2 of this very important seminar on museums, decolonization, and restitution, a global conversation. Today is the day that we are devoting our conversation to the matters of repatriation and restitution. And we have a really very interesting program. Our keynote speech by Samba Yonga starts us off this morning. And following that, we're going to have a session on law and policy. And following that, we're going to look at one of the sort of really interesting aspects of the restitution space, I suppose, in the role that digital and creativity is playing. And then later on, the very last session of the day is 5 speakers who will talk about positive examples, successful examples of restitution and repatriation. But we've asked them to take quite a critical look at this. And so we'll see that while there are tremendous opportunities and possibilities, there are also a lot of sort of bumps along the way that we have to take into consideration. So I think a very, very rich day, and we're looking forward to it very much. I think I wanted to say just one thing. I started yesterday by talking about some of the principles that underlied the overall thinking about putting together this seminar. And when we got to restitution, I think a couple of things applied. And one was we wanted to look at a number of different facets of it. And so I think the program where we're looking at community, we're looking at the legal framework and also the policy framework. We're looking at the role that digital and innovation can play, and then sort of a critical analysis of how things can be successfully restituted is part of that. I think the other thing is that it is a global conversation, and in fact the conversation lies between those who hold the material in often Western museums, and those who want it back. And there needs to be a dialogue facilitated between the two parties. And we also need to look at what leads up to restitution, and then what the impact on communities is once the objects are returned. So it's something of a continuum. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Samba Yonga is from Zambia. She's a co-founder of the Women's History Museum of Zambia, and she runs her own media and communications company, which numbers among its clients many international organizations who are looking for advice to work appropriately within the Zambian cultural space. And they would have very good advice from Samba, who is really very interested in the colonial and post-colonial narratives and what that means for people in Zambia today. And I think when we were putting together the seminar, there's a lot of the discourse around restitution and repatriation really focuses on the transfer of objects. What is less well documented and less spoken about is the reasons that communities want the objects back. And a lot of those reasons are intangible. And the meaning for communities and the significance and the value of these objects for those communities can really only be spoken about by the communities themselves. And it's for that reason I heard Samba speak earlier this year at a conference, and I thought she really was in that space, and that was what we wanted to hear. Please welcome Samba Yonga.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to start by saying thank you to ICOM, Shanghai University, and the many colleagues who have taken to the stage to share incredible insights, and everyone who has welcomed us here. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to read my notes because I have a lot to say and I don't want to forget anything. The history of knowledge production in Zambia and many parts of Africa has been impacted by the colonial experience that has disrupted dislocated, and decontextualized indigenous knowledge systems and artifacts. As is well known, this happened through separating artifacts from their source communities, thereby rendering misrepresented meanings which have caused generations of memory loss and knowledge asymmetries that till present day have not been adequately addressed. These inaccurate rendered meanings continue to be the source of knowledge for museums and knowledge institutions with little consideration for the communities of origin in Africa. In the past few years or so, ethnographic museums and institutions of knowledge have centered conversations around their problematic collections of indigenous artifacts and knowledge from source communities in Africa in an attempt to correct the asymmetries created as a result of the dislocation and decontextualization. Great as this effort has been, there remains a reduced engagement and a lack of acknowledgement of the source communities and how they can contribute to the process of reorientation of museums and institutions of knowledge. The colonial legacy, largely responsible for the dislocation of artifacts and indigenous knowledge systems, did not only decontextualize artifacts when they removed them from their place of origin, but also impacted the source communities and left them to deal with the grief, loss, and gradual invalidation of their knowledge. As part of the continuous quest for respectful forms of practice of museums and knowledge production, this presentation interrogates how this can be done to ensure an equitable and inclusive process. Generations of this separation has now manifested into source communities that have not only lost the value of their knowledge, but also lost the agency to communicate that they are valid knowledge producers and keepers. In many cases, they have also lost the ability to produce this knowledge. Museums have served as identity formation institutions that have largely legitimized Eurocentric cultural hierarchical systems. The byproduct of this in Africa, or Zambia, where I'm from, has led to delegitimized and invalidated indigenous knowledge systems in source communities that are not necessarily given a voice. I would like to share examples that show the impact of artifact dislocation on a source community. I want to start with the story of an artifact in a museum. This artifact is currently in the National Museums of World Cultures in Stockholm, Sweden, and in its current state is producing knowledge without the connection of the source. This separation means there is a lack of representation and cultural context that the artifact does not contain when exhibited outside its original source community. This situation has perpetuated what Dr. Ines Castro refers to as stereotypes and fixed attributions that may not be accurate in relation to the artifacts and continue to be validated as knowledge. The impact of this separation has caused a disruption of narratives, arrested development of knowledge production of source communities, distorted knowledge production by non-indigenous scholars, and a manifestation of splintered communities and populations. I'll break down these further. And I would like to give examples from our own ethnic communities in Zambia, including my own. The first is the separation of artifacts and knowledge from the community. The Likumbi Liamize is a rich traditional ceremony of the Luvale, Chokwe, and Luchazi people in northwestern part of Zambia and parts of Congo and Angola, I come from this part of Zambia. One of the most significant parts is the procession of the Makishi that you can see there. It's a majestic parade of masked figures who are the embodiment of ancestors that appear during the very important coming of age ritual and ceremony of initiate boys called Mukanda. The ancestors come to life through the Makishi and bring their knowledge from the past to the present and give these teachings to the initiates as a rite of passage. The Makishi's many lessons and rituals teach the boys values and life skills that relate to livelihood and being a good and responsible person in society. How to look after a homestead, being in harmony with nature, how to extract wealth with care, how to care and till the land, how to be responsible leaders in their communities. If we examine some of the teachings closely today, they could be likened to environmental conservation, responsible mineral extraction, organic food production and nutrition, responsible agriculture, technology of blacksmithing, and even meditation and mindfulness. And yet, 100 years ago, when this knowledge was removed and systematically oppressed within the communities without care or sense of responsibility, this community was denied the opportunity to produce and validate knowledge systems that today are valued practices across the world. What happened in this context was not qualified as knowledge production, and yet today we know it is, even if it's not recognized as such. The National Museum of World Cultures in Stockholm has this costume of the Makishi, and none of it had the context and nuance I just shared. When the mask costume and its elements were removed from the community and brought into the museum, it was separated from the knowledge and made invalid both for the community and for the museum. The significance and actual knowledge transmission gets lost in a void that is unable to be unlocked because there is no direct reference to the source communities that hold this knowledge. For over 100 years, this has been happening over and over again, making the value of the object for both the museum and the community almost irrelevant, except for the fact that it is an object of curiosity. The situation I describe also impacts the narratives and how they end up being disseminated and recorded as knowledge. This disadvantages those who are not in the position to manage this process of producing this knowledge. The arrested development of knowledge production of source communities brings the question of who manages the production knowledge in our own countries, how this situation has impacted the status quo as well. The universities, museums, and institutions in Zambia and many African countries use Western frameworks of knowledge which excludes practices like the Mukanda rite of passage ceremony as a way of learning or producing knowledge or even transmitting it. The privilege of education for many African scholars and museology experts restricts their learning to theories, themes, and subjects that are mostly far removed from indigenous studies. So this does not give the knowledge the chance to develop. Then there is also the distorted knowledge production by non-indigenous scholars. This brings to attention the fact that knowledge of indigenous people or systems of source communities in the museums in Zambia and parts of Africa is not robust. An example I can refer to again using the Makishi artifact of the Lubale is the matrilineal society, which means historically they gave women significant positions of leadership, including having positions like female kings, women owning land, and women were seen as equals. And yet now, in our current state of perception of our own culture, we have development organizations that come from the West to come and teach us how to include women and manage our perception and cultural norm where Zambians perceive women as not being leaders because of our tradition. Which tradition? The one that had women leaders but was erased and violently opposed? Or is it a reference to the patriarchy introduced by the colonizers? It is well documented that in the 1900s, the colonizing efforts in Zambia had it as a policy to remove female chiefs and leaders, since it did not fall within their governing policy at the time. And curiously, up to this day, even after 60 years of independence, it is only the male chief that is mostly acknowledged. And unfortunately, our own museums and knowledge institutions have perpetuated this narrative. This is not uncommon in many Zambian or other African societies. As a result of some of these observations raised, there remains a splintered community that is facing the deep grief, loss, and an arrested development that limits the community's rights to revitalize their knowledge and continues to minimize the value of knowledge that even the communities now firmly believe that the Western framework of knowledge is better than the local knowledge. Much has been talked about on what is needed to correct this situation, and there are some African scholars and knowledge keepers doing this work already. These are some of the interventions that we have been exploring. African scholars, intellectuals, and museum experts, and their important contribution to the process. Even as the reorientation and restitution process continues, we need to see more African scholars engaging in African-based research and expertise. This contribution should be in a way that does not see them influenced with trending theories and discourse that is largely dictated by the global North. The nature of academic publishing as it is does not allow space for diverse discourse. Looking into what Dr. Livingstone Muchefa in Zimbabwe describes as community intellectual voices is vital for this discourse. Another intervention is creating agency for African source communities. Reviving and validating obscured indigenous knowledge systems, and consolidating the restitution process through the use of source communities that still have the legitimate knowledge that has survived and is complementing it with various technologies to provide an immediacy to the process of correction. We have conducted provenance research with the communities of origin for the objects that are in the National Museums of World Cultures that has birthed a project called Shared Histories, Empowering Women's Narratives. And one of the main outputs for this project was creating a digital repatriation document and platform where a portion of the 800 plus Zambian artifacts, documents, and images are in the museum in Sweden and are transferred to this platform. It's much like the Digital Benin. During this process of development, we also felt that it was important for us to return to the source communities and verify the objects with the community knowledge keepers. We did not know what to expect or what would happen, as some of these objects had not been seen for 100 years by the communities. We were delighted to find elders who were able to not only identify the objects, but they were able to give additional context learning, and now this metadata is being added to the objects in the museum. So here you see pictures. Before I showed you the platform, the shared histories. So on this platform, we're slowly adding up to 800 objects that are being accessed by different communities. And here we have pictures of us going into the communities. You can see the women looking at the objects on the platform and identifying them. And this is some of our researchers from the university who helped us. And you can see some of the objects there that they identified. And the woman in the middle there is one of the oldest members of the community. I think at the time she was 98 years old, and she's still alive. And she was able to provide a lot of context. And here you see her again identifying the objects. The final one, but not exhaustive at all, is recognizing the power of language. Using indigenous language when coding and decoding indigenous knowledge systems and artifacts. Sometimes meaning and value is lost through translation, and we need to restore that level of meaning making through accurate decoding of language. This can only be done with African experts and source communities, and I can give an example. This is a chipao. It's a mbunda pot. Descriptively, the word means pot, and in the museum, that is how it was described. And yet, in the original context of its function, it means wealth, because if one owned this pot, you were wealthy. This provides meaning in a different way from its description, and when you understand it in its context, you can decode the history and knowledge of the artifact that goes beyond describing the item. We often refer to this loss of context as dismembering, because parts of the knowledge have been dismembered and the broken pieces are presented as a whole. It is time to bring those dismembered parts of the body together. I am encouraged daily in this work as I draw research from the fellow experts and scholars such as Victoria Chidungu, Dr. Jessica Hernandez, Dr. Michael Barrett, Mulenga Kapwepwe, Dr. Muchefa, Chao Maina, and Dr. Inez de Castro, and many more who inspire us and confirm every day that the work we are doing is valid, not only for Africans, but for communities all around the global South who continue to experience this phenomenon. If we do not do this, both the institutions and the source community will continue to lose. We have to do the work to undo the legacy of distorted knowledge production in African indigenous spaces and build a legacy that attempts to be inclusive, representative, equitable, diverse, and validating for all. I thank you for your attention. Shishu. Can I stay here? Okay, stay.
So this is unique, two people actually up here. Oh, here we are. Is that better? Thanks. Okay, just before we take questions from the floor and also look at the questions that may have come in on the chat this morning, I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you, Samba. One was that I was really interested in what you said about the interruption of knowledge systems and the profound impact that that has had on Zambian society and African society in general. And I guess the question is, if objects are returned, that seems to be one moment in a much longer process. So what other systems or frameworks have to be developed to enable those objects to be reassimilated and those knowledge systems to be recovered?
I think it's at various levels. We've had this debate. I think it's on. Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. We've had this debate over and over again in our own institutions and with other museums. The reality is, even if all the objects had to come back today, there's several things we have to consider. Least of all, the infrastructure to house them. The second part is also to consider when they do go back into their communities, how are they integrated? Who will be the knowledge keepers? How do we document them? So there are several layers that we need to implement, starting with before the object actually arrives. And part of the process was us going to the communities, talking to the community members, understanding what knowledge they still do have. What helped was us having the objects and going back and seeing whether they can identify them. But it's certainly identifying the communities themselves, understanding what parts of the knowledge system still exist, then connecting those two systems together and seeing what kind of knowledge can be produced as a result of that.
Wow. Ben, I think this next question sort of follows a little bit on from that. You talked about the fact that in the main, African museums have replicated Western models of what we understand as a museum. So if museums are going to be part of that process, ultimately, when objects are recovered, what would a more African museum look like? What would a decolonized African museum look like?
I think it's a billion-dollar question. I think it's a question we ask ourselves because, first of all, museums as a concept is not African. You know, a lot of African artifacts are living histories. So we live with them, we use them, we functionalize them, and they're demystified. Yet in a Eurocentric museum, they're mystified. So I think there is that aspect that we have to consider and maybe reorient and rethink the idea of museums. Someone said demuseumizing the museum and creating perhaps a new institution altogether.
Yeah, okay. I have lots of other questions, but I'm going to pause now and just open it up to the floor. Are there questions that other people would like to ask? And we have a mic over here. You don't? No? Is there a question here from... Can we have a mic over here, please? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting presentation and discussions. So, I'm archaeologist. So, when you talk about the object from archaeological site, always the context is gone, and totally distorted sometimes. Sometimes, you know, the artifact found some other place quite away from the location and from the time of culture. So even if the current ethnographic collections in the future, the context will be gone.
Yes.
So I think my original thinking is a museum is a kind of the human being's system for collecting informations for their future to adapt to nature. So is a kind of a complex body of information which is represented by some object from modern world or archaeological ages. So decolonizing, so if we consider back to the context of the site, of the object, then we may have some trouble to back into the context of some object were in the museum. Yeah. So that is we need to think about in discussion about the colonization of object in museums. I hope it will help some our discussions. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'll agree if I understand your question clearly. And I think that's part of correcting the asymmetries that we're talking about, because we want, as much as possible, as there are objects in the museum, for them to produce the correct knowledge. And this can actually add to the process of this ongoing knowledge production.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating and important.
I'm really interested in the practical things that need to happen to support the process of decolonisation. And I was particularly interested in the digital repatriation document and platform that you referred to. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that model, how it was funded, and whether or not you see this as a model that other museums might also adopt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting story. So I was in Sweden for other work, and a friend of mine there said, oh, you should go to the Ethnographic Museum. There's an African curator there. He does interesting work. So I was like, okay. So I went there, and when I entered the space, he was like, actually, we have Zambian artifacts here. Let me show you. So I looked at him and I'm like, what are Zambian artifacts doing in Sweden? Because you wouldn't naturally think of Sweden as a colonizer. But actually what happened is that in the years of British voyages, they would rent space in the ships and come to Africa, and that's how they acquired their collections. And this was surprising because even the African curators said that they hadn't had contact with the Zambian government or Zambian museums, and nobody even knew that any of these artifacts were in Sweden. And that was a bit shocking to us because we were like, how is this possible? We need to find a way for people to get contact, whether it's the museums, whether it's the general public. And one of the things of building institutions and doing some of this work is that it takes time, right? And we appreciate that because the process needs to be thorough, the process it needs to be rigorous, but we also wanted a way to democratize the information and access to the objects. And the easiest and quickest way of doing this was creating a digital platform where we'd put the objects onto the 3D platform and it could be immediately accessed. So we got some funding and support to work together with the museum and with digital experts and design experts to create this platform from both Zambia and Sweden. And we worked with experts in the field, we worked with the source communities to define the objects and to select and choose the objects which would be most relevant and important to put on the platform. And it's an ongoing process. We have, I think, about 150 objects on the platform so far. Hopefully we can get all the 800 plus objects onto it eventually. Yes.
Thanks, Samba, for your nice presentation. We really like it so much. I'm just curious to ask you, do you have a missing list of your object and how you, if you have, how you develop it in the future? And how many objects you know they from your country, they displayed outside of your country? Thank you.
So we don't have a comprehensive list of all the objects that are outside of Zambia. We started the work with the National Museums of World Cultures, and we know the number of objects in that museum. We do know that there are objects and artifacts in other museums as well, and we would like to replicate the process with other museums. So this was more like a pilot project, and then we'll do it again with other museums.
A general question. How can museums contribute to restitution?
A big question. Well, from what we've seen is that different museums are doing different things. And I think it's a discussion that we're having as well. Like, should there be a consolidated single way of doing it, or should each museum choose a path on their own? I think there needs to be some guidelines around how it should be done, especially if you're thinking of the regions and the spaces, because as much as there are similarities, there are also some differences. But definitely the most important thing is reorienting the discussion around it, because I remember being at another conference where there was resistance, and there still is. And I think a lot more museums need to come on board with this discussion and intervention.
And if I can just sort of pursue that a little bit, Samba, when you have noticed resistance, what is the source of the resistance? What form is that resistance taking?
I think mostly people are afraid of change, and institutions are afraid of change. A wonderful sentence that somebody said at one of these conferences is like, museums have stayed the same, whereas everything else around the museum has changed. So does it make sense to stay the same? It doesn't. Mm-hmm. So it's inevitable. The change is coming. It's just how fast or how slow the museums will change, yeah.
I also wanted to go back to sort of an earlier part of your talk, and you were talking about how African knowledge systems were actively proscribed, by colonizers, and in fact sort of penalized. Often local populations were penalized from trying to continue them. So were there pockets of resistance? Was there resistance to that,
There was a lot of resistance, but you only see it in the footnotes of the colonial documents. We actually created an animation called Leading Ladies, and we were only able to extract the narratives of these women who were resistant towards colonial rule because they put them in footnotes in the archival documents. And that's the only way you would know that there's resistance. It wouldn't be in the main documents, or they wouldn't openly talk about it. And this is something that I refer to when I say, destroying a sense of who the people are. Yeah. Because the people will develop thinking that they never resisted, thinking that there were never people who stood up for them, and yet they were. But even that was erased and removed. So you have no way of knowing that your system had an indigenous knowledge, or had a resistance, or had a way of communicating that protected the communities.
So I guess if you're trying to sort of retell those stories,
thank you.
You're telling the story not only of resistance, but about the validation of those knowledge systems and their efficacy. And is that institutionalized in any way? Is that part of the education system now in Zambia? How is that being transmitted?
Curiously, it's not. And this is some of the work that we're trying to do. We're working with universities. We're also working with the education curriculum to start reintroducing some of these narratives and knowledge systems into the education system.
Thank you very much, Samba. I mean, that's been a wonderful way to start the morning, and really inspiring sort of talk. Can you join me in thanking Samba for her presentation?